The moment you let a woman with money convince you that your daughter isn't good enough for her son, you start signing away pieces of your family without ever noticing the paper in your hand. My wife and I spent 26 years believing that if we just kept our heads down and stayed grateful for the crumbs we were given, we'd eventually earn a seat at that family's table. We were wrong. It took a shattered wine glass, a bruise shaped like a handprint on my daughter's collarbone, and one very quiet phone call to a man I hadn't spoken to in 15 years to teach me that some doors are worth kicking down. Welcome back to the channel. If you've ever sat at a table where you weren't wanted just to keep peace in your family, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. I read every one of them, neighbor. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 63 years old, and for 35 years I ran a small engine repair shop off Route 9 outside Asheville, North Carolina. My knuckles are scarred from decades of chainsaw blades and lawnmower blades, and my back tells me every morning exactly how many years I've spent bent over a workbench. I never made much money, but I made an honest living, and I raised my daughter to believe that hard work and kindness were worth more than a fat bank account. That belief nearly cost her everything. My wife Diane is 61. She taught second grade at Weaverville Elementary for 31 years before she retired, and there isn't a single person in that town who doesn't know her name or remember the extra granola bars she kept in her desk drawer for kids who came to school hungry. Diane has a way of making everyone feel like family within about 5 minutes of meeting them. She's soft-spoken. She forgives too easily. And until 3 months ago, I would have told you she'd never raised her voice at another human being in her entire life. Our daughter Renee is our only child. She's 29, works as a pediatric nurse at Mission Hospital, and has the same gentle heart her mother has, the kind of heart that gets taken advantage of by people who know exactly what they're doing. Renee married Bradley Kessler 2.5 years ago. Bradley was 34 at the time, a senior wealth management advisor at a private firm downtown, driving a black Range Rover that cost more than my entire shop was worth. His mother, Patricia Kessler, owned 3 high-end boutique hotels scattered across the Blue Ridge Mountains, and she made it clear within the first 10 minutes of meeting us that our family was, in her words, refreshingly simple. Diane and I lived in the same modest brick ranch house we'd bought 30 years earlier. Patricia lived in a restored plantation-style estate up in Weaverville with a wrought iron gate and a fountain out front shaped like a swan. My truck was a 2011 Chevy Silverado with 210,000 miles on it. Her driveway alone probably cost more than that truck new. But Renee loved Bradley, or at least she loved the version of him he showed her before the wedding rings were on. Saturday, November the 14th, 6:40 in the evening. Patricia was hosting her annual Fall Harvest Gala, a black tie fundraiser for the local children's hospital wing that bore her family name, held in the grand ballroom of her flagship hotel. Diane and I had been invited every year since the wedding, though it was made clear through Patricia's tight smile and the seating chart that we were tolerated more than welcomed. This year there were nearly 60 guests, doctors, hotel investors, a state senator, and half the country club crowd from 3 counties over, all dressed in gowns and tuxedos beneath crystal chandeliers the size of small cars. Diane had spent 2 weeks hand-sewing a raffle basket theme around Renee's favorite children's book series, something she'd been asked to help coordinate as a volunteer for the cause. She was proud of that basket. She'd stayed up past midnight 3 nights in a row, gluing tiny felt animals onto a quilt she'd made herself. At 7:15, the silent auction floor was packed shoulder to shoulder, servers weaving through with trays of champagne and past hors d'oeuvres. Diane was carrying her finished raffle basket toward the display table near the stage, moving carefully through the crowd in her good navy dress, the one she'd bought special for the occasion. Bradley was standing near the edge of that same table, red-faced and 2 scotches past sober, boasting loudly to a group of hotel investors about a real estate deal he claimed credit for closing. Diane came around the corner of the table at the exact moment Bradley threw his arm out wide to punctuate some story, laughing at his own joke, and his elbow caught the basket square in the side. The basket flew from Diane's hands. It hit the polished marble floor and burst apart, felt animals and raffle tickets scattering everywhere, and the glass mason jar of hard candy she'd tucked inside. shattered into 100 pieces right at the feet of the state senator's wife. The music from the string quartet in the corner kept playing for about 3 more seconds before somebody signaled them to stop. Diane dropped to her knees immediately, gathering the pieces, her cheeks burning red with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, I'll clean this up right now. I didn't see." Bradley spun around, and before she'd even finished her sentence, before a single person could react, he grabbed her by the upper arm and yanked her up off the floor so hard her shoulder popped audibly. "Watch where you're going, you clumsy old woman," he snarled, loud enough that every conversation within 30 feet went dead silent. Diane gasped, stumbling backward, and that's when Patricia appeared, stepping directly between Diane and me before I could even cross the room, her face a mask of icy composure. She didn't look at Diane, who was standing there rubbing her arm, tears welling in her eyes, in front of 60 strangers in formal wear. Patricia looked straight at me, her voice smooth as glass and just as cold. "Walter, your wife has ruined the centerpiece display and embarrassed my son in front of half our board of directors. I think it's best if you two head home for the evening." I looked around that ballroom. 60 people. Doctors, senators, hotel executives, the very people whose donations funded a children's hospital wing. Not one of them said a word. Not one of them moved. Bradley straightened his cufflinks, glanced down at Diane like she was a stain on his shoe, and turned back to his investors, as if nothing had happened at all. If you're already feeling something in your chest right now, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It truly helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. My hands were shaking, but my voice came out steady. I walked past Patricia, knelt down, and gently helped my wife gather what was left of her basket. I didn't say a word to Bradley. I didn't say a word to Patricia. I wrapped my arm around Diane's shoulders, guided her past the whispering crowd, and walked her out into the cold parking lot. We sat in my truck for a long while, engine running, heat blasting, Diane sobbing quietly into a cocktail napkin she still had clutched in her fist. Then the passenger door of the truck cracked open, and Renee climbed in fast, breathing hard, mascara streaked down her face, still in the deep green cocktail dress she'd worn to support her mother-in-law's cause. She reached across the console to grab her mother's hand, and as she did, the long sleeve of her dress rode up her forearm, and underneath the dome light of my truck, I saw it clearly. Not a small mark. A deep, spreading bruise wrapped around her upper arm in the unmistakable shape of 4 fingers and a thumb, purple at the center, yellowing at the edges, where an older injury hadn't fully healed before a fresh one had been laid on top of it. My chest went hollow. "Renee," I said, barely above a whisper, turning around in my seat. "What happened to your arm?" She yanked her sleeve down fast, her whole body folding inward. "Dad, please, don't make this into something. He's under a lot of pressure at work right now, that's all." He didn't mean it. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. My hands stayed still on the wheel, but something inside my chest cracked clean down the middle. "Since about 8 months after the wedding," she said, voice barely audible, tears sliding freely now. "He told me nobody would ever believe me over him. He handles all our money, Dad, every account. His mother told me, a good wife just learns how to keep the peace in her own home." That was the moment something in me that had stayed quiet for 63 years simply stopped being quiet. I hadn't raised my voice in that ballroom because I was too stunned to move. But sitting in that cold truck, looking at the marks on my daughter's arm and the tears on my wife's face, whatever was left of my patience for staying polite around cruel people burned away completely. Keeping the peace, I realized, had just been a coward's excuse for letting a dangerous man keep hurting the people I loved. "Renee," I said, meeting her eyes in the rearview mirror, "you are not stepping foot back in that house tonight. You're coming home with us." "Dad, he'll never let this go," she whispered. "He knows the mayor. His mother's on the hospital board and the zoning commission. They own half this town. They don't own me," I said quietly. "And after tonight, they don't own you either." Sunday, November the 15th, 7 in the morning. While Diane and Renee slept upstairs, wrung out from a night that had drained every ounce of them, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a legal pad and coffee I never touched. I didn't call the sheriff's department that morning. In a town the size of ours, A family that funds half the hospital and sits on the zoning board can make an assault complaint quietly disappear before the paperwork even reaches a judge's desk. I understood exactly how that kind of power worked because I'd watched it work for years from the outside looking in. If I wanted Bradley Kessler to actually answer for what he'd done, I couldn't walk up to his front door and put my fist through it. That would cost me everything and cost him nothing but a bruise he'd heal from in a week. I needed to hit the one thing that mattered to that family more than their reputation. Their money. I picked up my phone and I called a man named Harold Sims. Harold was 68, a retired forensic accountant who used to work fraud cases for the State Banking Commission, and he'd been my neighbor for 12 years before he moved into town to be closer to his grandkids. We used to fish together every spring before his knees gave out. "Walter," Harold said, his gravel of a voice coming through clear on the line. "It's barely light out. This better be good news or a funeral." "Neither," I said, leaning over my legal pad. "I need your help, Harold, and I need you to keep this between us for now." I told him everything. The gala, the way Bradley grabbed Diane, the bruises going up and down my daughter's arm, months of them, layered on top of each other like tree rings. Harold went quiet on the line for a long moment. "Bradley Kessler," he finally said, "Senior Wealth Advisor over at Blue Ridge Capital Partners. I know exactly who that is." "You know something," I said. "I know that firm has had 2 compliance complaints filed against it in the last 3 years that got quietly settled before they ever reached a courtroom," Harold said. "Give me until Tuesday. And Walter, get your daughter to a doctor today. Have every single mark on her body photographed and dated. Today, not next week. Tuesday, November the 17th, 1 in the afternoon." Harold showed up at my shop carrying a scuffed brown accordion folder thick as a phone book. We sat in the back office with the space heater running, out of earshot of any customers dropping off their mowers for the winter. "Here's what people never understand about men like Bradley Kessler," Harold said, spreading printouts across my desk. "Men who grow up with money think the money makes them invisible. So they get sloppy. They leave a paper trail a child could follow if the child knew where to look." He tapped a stack of client statements. "Bradley doesn't just manage individual portfolios, Walter. He manages retirement accounts for 211 clients, most of them retired school teachers and retired mill workers, right here in this county. People just like your Diane." He slid a spreadsheet toward me. "Now look at the returns he's been reporting to his clients versus the actual trade confirmations from the custodian bank." I squinted at the numbers on the page. "These don't match up at all." "No, they don't," Harold said, with a small, cold smile. "He's been running a Ponzi structure inside a licensed firm, Walter, taking new client deposits and using them to pay out fake returns to older clients so nobody asks questions, while he skims the difference into an offshore account tied to a shell corporation his mother helped him set up under her hotel group's name. It's securities fraud and wire fraud, and it's been running for at least 4 years. How do we prove all this?" I asked. "We don't have to prove it ourselves," Harold said. "We just have to hand it to the people whose entire job is proving it. But we're not going through local police on this one." Harold pulled a business card from his shirt pocket and slid it across the desk. It bore the seal of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. The name printed on it was Agent Denise Okafor. "She was my student intern 20 years ago at the Banking Commission," Harold said. "She doesn't care about Patricia Kessler's charity galas. And she has 0 patience for men who steal from retired school teachers." If a story like this is the kind of justice you like to see, go ahead and drop a like on this video right now. It helps more than you'd think. Have you ever watched someone who thought they'd never face consequences finally run headfirst into them? Tell me about it down in the comments. Thursday, November the 19th, 3 in the afternoon. I spent 2 days moving quietly. I didn't send Bradley a single angry text message. I didn't call Patricia. When Bradley started texting Renee, first demanding she come home, then threatening to freeze every joint account they shared if she didn't respond immediately, I had Renee send back one calm sentence. "I'm staying with my parents while I speak with an attorney," he wrote back within 90 seconds. "You have nothing without me, and you know it." He genuinely believed that. At 3 that afternoon, I drove Renee to the county courthouse. We met with an attorney named Carol Whitfield, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who specialized in domestic violence cases and didn't waste a single word on small talk. We filed for an emergency protective order, submitting 22 time-stamped photographs, documenting bruising across Renee's arms, shoulder, and ribs, along with a signed medical report from the urgent care doctor who'd examined her the day after the gala. The judge signed the order within the hour. Bradley was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of Renee, of Diane and me, or our home. Then came the second half of the plan. At 4:30 that same afternoon, Harold and I sat down in a small conference room downtown with Agent Denise Okafor and a representative from the State Securities Division. We laid out a 200-page binder documenting every falsified statement, every mismatched trade confirmation, every shell company transfer Harold had traced. Agent Okafor flipped through the first 20 pages without saying anything at all. Then she looked up at me over her glasses. "Mr. Briggs, how exactly did a small engine mechanic and a retired accountant assemble a file this clean?" "My friend spent 30 years learning how greedy men hide money," I said. The trail was sitting right there in public custodian filings. Nobody with the authority to look ever bothered to look. She closed the binder slowly. "If these figures match what we pull from the custodian bank's records, and I expect they will, your son-in-law isn't looking at a fine and a slap on the wrist. He's looking at federal securities fraud charges that could put him away for years." "Good," I said, "because he thinks none of this can touch him." Friday, November the 20th, 6 in the evening. This was the night Bradley sat at home in his 4-bedroom colonial up on Reams Creek Road, Patricia there with him along with 2 of her hotel business partners, drinking wine and discussing how to smooth over what they were calling Renee's little episode. They believed a firm lawyer and enough family pressure would have her back home within the week. They had absolutely no idea what was coming up their driveway. At exactly 6:15, 2 unmarked black sedans pulled up outside the house. 4 people stepped out into the cold evening air. They were not sheriff's deputies coming to take a polite statement. They were federal agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission, accompanied by 2 county deputies carrying a federal search warrant for every computer, financial ledger, and mobile device inside that house. I know exactly how it unfolded because one of those deputies, a young man named Deputy Alvarez, had been a student of Diane's 15 years earlier and made a point of calling me that same night. When the doorbell rang, Bradley answered it himself, wine glass in hand, expecting maybe a neighbor or a late delivery. Instead, Agent Okafor held up her credentials and read the warrant aloud in a voice that carried straight through the open door into the marble foyer behind him. "Bradley Kessler, we are executing a federal search warrant on this property in connection with an ongoing investigation into securities fraud, wire fraud, and falsification of client records." Patricia came rushing up behind him, her face draining white, her rings clicking together as she threw her hands up. "Do you have any idea who I am? Who my attorney is? Get off this property immediately." One of the deputies stepped forward, blocking her path with a firm hand raised. "Ma'am, step back and keep your hands visible. If you interfere with federal agents executing a lawful warrant, you will be arrested tonight." Bradley's face went from smug irritation to genuine, hollow terror in the span of about 5 seconds. The wine glass in his hand shook so badly that dark red wine sloshed over the rim and splashed across the pale hardwood floor, in almost the exact spot where Diane's basket had shattered less than a week earlier. "This is insane. This is my father-in-law's doing," Bradley stammered, his voice cracking apart, all the smooth confidence gone from it. "That grease monkey mechanic is trying to ruin my life because he's jealous." "Sir," Agent Okafor said calmly, pulling a pair of handcuffs from her belt, "your father-in-law didn't falsify 4 years of client account statements. You did that yourself. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." In front of his own mother, in front of her stunned business partners standing frozen in the dining room doorway, Bradley Kessler was turned toward his own front door and cuffed. He didn't fight. He didn't argue anymore. He just started crying. A thin, wheezing sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the house his mother's money had built for him. The agents walked him down his own front steps in dress socks. his shoes left sitting untouched by the door. Saturday, November the 21st, 10 in the morning. The fallout spread through that town like wildfire through dry brush. By Saturday, Blue Ridge Capital Partners issued a public statement announcing Bradley Kessler had been terminated immediately, pending a full forensic audit of every account he'd ever managed. The state froze all assets connected to his name and to the shell company registered under Patricia's hotel group. Within a week, 2 of Patricia's boutique hotels lost their financing when the bank that held their commercial loans discovered the same shell company had been used to launder funds skimmed from Bradley's clients. The local paper ran his photograph on the front page beneath the headline, "Local Advisor Indicted in Multi-Million-Dollar Client Fraud Scheme." On the following Tuesday, Renee went back to the Reams Creek house with 2 sheriff's deputies to collect her belongings, her car, and the golden retriever they'd adopted together. Patricia was sitting alone on the front steps in a plain gray cardigan, looking like a woman who'd aged a decade in a week. The grand house behind her sat dark, curtains drawn tight. When Renee walked past carrying a box of her things, Patricia looked up, her voice small for the first time since I'd known her. "Renee, please, talk to your father. Tell him to make this stop. Bradley could go away for years. We can still fix this. We can talk to the prosecutor." Renee stopped walking. She looked down at the woman who had watched her son bruise an innocent woman's arm and told the room to blame the woman instead. The woman who had spent years telling her daughter-in-law that silence was a wife's duty. Renee pulled her sleeve up just enough to let the fading yellow-green marks catch the late morning light. "He did this to himself, Patricia," she said, her voice completely even. "My dad just made sure everyone finally saw it." She walked down that long driveway, got into my truck, and never once looked back. 7 months later, it's June now, and the mountains around Asheville are that deep, heavy green they only get in early summer. Bradley Kessler pled guilty to 3 counts of federal securities fraud and 1 count of wire fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence recommendation, though the judge made clear at sentencing she wasn't inclined toward leniency given the number of retirees he'd defrauded. He reports next month to a federal facility in Kentucky to begin serving 5 years and 2 months. His firm permanently lost its license to operate in this state. Patricia was forced to sell 2 of her 3 hotels to cover restitution payments ordered by the court, and she now lives in a small condominium near the interstate, a long way down from the Swan Fountain and the wrought iron gate. Renee's divorce was finalized 2 months ago. She walked away with a settlement large enough to buy a small house of her own about 10 minutes from ours, and she's back to working full shifts at the hospital, laughing again with the other nurses, sleeping through the night without waking up at every creak in the house. The bruises are long gone. Sometimes I still catch her rubbing that spot on her arm out of habit, but her eyes have that light back in them that I hadn't realized was missing until I saw it return. Last evening, Diane and I sat out on our back porch after supper, the air thick with honeysuckle and the sound of cicadas starting up for the night. She brought out 2 glasses of sweet tea, sat down next to me in the porch, swing her father built 40 years ago, and rested her head against my shoulder without a word. The shoulder Bradley wrenched that night healed up fine, though she still favors it a little on cold mornings. I took a slow sip of tea and looked out over our yard, and I didn't feel anything like triumph. I didn't feel like celebrating another man's downfall. I just felt still, in a way I hadn't felt in years. For most of my life, I believed that being a good husband and a good father meant keeping quiet, staying grateful, and letting people with more money than me set the rules in every room I walked into. I was wrong about that. Being the man of this family was never about avoiding a fight. It's about being the one thing standing between the people you love and whoever means to hurt them, even when that means going quiet and patient instead of loud. Bradley and his mother built their whole lives on the idea that people without money were people without power. They found out the hard way that a patient man with the truth on his side doesn't need to raise his voice or his fists. He just needs enough time, enough paper, and enough backbone to let the truth finish the job on its own. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If this story meant something to you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and let me know your thoughts down below. Protecting the people you love is never something you'll regret. neighbor. Take care of each other out there, and I'll see you in the next one.